My hands trembled as I read the bright red notice taped to my front door. $500. That was the fine the HOA expected me to pay for keeping an unauthorized exotic pet. I looked down at Whiskers, my completely ordinary orange tabby cat, rubbing against my legs the same way he did every evening when I got home from work. Exotic? He was as common as a peanut butter sandwich. After a long day at the law firm, finding this absurd notice waiting for me only added to my frustration. The date on the paper showed it had been placed that morning, likely right after I left for work. But what truly set my anger ablaze was the signature at the bottom. Karen Thompson, with her newly claimed title, HOA Board President. Karen had been in the neighborhood for only 6 months, yet she had already built a reputation for all the wrong reasons. She had complained that Mr. Rodriguez's wind chimes were too ethnic, reported Mrs. Chin's memorial garden as a violation of property aesthetics, and now she had come after my cat. The irony was that I had lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years, 10 of which I had served as the HOA's legal counsel. In fact, I had personally written every single bylaw they were now attempting to use against me. But Karen had never done her research. She had not even bothered to check the records or introduce herself properly. I grabbed my phone and snapped photos of the notice before carefully peeling it off my door. Through my front window, I spotted Karen sitting on her porch across the street, pretending to water her illegal pink flamingo lawn ornaments. Yes, illegal. Section 7.3 of the bylaws specifically addressed lawn decorations, a rule I had originally drafted to be flexible for reasonable homeowners. But right now, those flamingos were the least of my concerns. Inside my house, I found another copy of the notice slipped under my door, along with a thick packet of violation documentation. I spread everything out on my kitchen table while Whiskers jumped up to investigate. The so-called evidence included blurry photos of my cat sitting in the window, a highlighted section of the pet regulations, and, this part nearly made me laugh, a printed WebMD article about exotic pet diseases. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Tom Baker. "Did you get one too?" I was about to reply when I heard voices outside. Through the kitchen window, I saw Karen leading her friend, Susan Barnes, door to door, distributing thick stacks of papers. They stopped at Mrs. Chin's house, and my stomach twisted. The elderly widow had already suffered enough while mourning her late husband, and now Karen was harassing her over a garden she had lovingly built in his memory. I was debating whether to step outside and intervene when my doorbell rang. It was Bob Miller, our neighborhood treasurer for the past 8 years. His usually cheerful expression was clouded with concern. "Listen," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "You need to know what happened at today's emergency board meeting." Karen pushed through a series of new enforcement measures. She's targeting at least 6 other homeowners with fines. She's calling it her Neighborhood Improvement Initiative. I invited Bob inside, grabbing a notepad as he shared more details. Karen had somehow convinced the board to grant her direct enforcement authority, a direct violation of Section 3.2 of the bylaws. She had also appointed Susan as her so-called enforcement deputy, a role that did not even exist in our HOA structure. As Bob left, I walked him to the door, just in time to see Karen marching up Mrs. Chin's driveway, another notice in hand. Through the evening air, I could hear Mrs. Chin's distressed voice. "But this bench, it's all I have left of him." That was it. I had written those bylaws to protect the community, not to be weaponized against innocent homeowners. I turned back inside, heading straight for my home office. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, she was about to learn what happens when you challenge the person who wrote them. I glanced at Whiskers, now curled up on my desk. "What do you say, buddy? Ready to teach them about karma?" He blinked lazily and purred, which I took as a yes. I had no idea at the time, but this was just the beginning of what would become the biggest HOA showdown our neighborhood had ever seen. I walked into the HOA meeting room with my folder of documents, fully prepared to have a calm discussion about the absurd fine. But Karen was already there, seated at the head of the table like a self-proclaimed queen ruling over her domain. She tapped her hot pink acrylic nails against the wooden surface, her smug smile making my stomach turn. "Good evening, everyone," I said politely while taking my seat, though I quickly noticed something unusual. Half of the regular board members were missing, and in their place sat Karen's tennis partners, Susan and Linda, 2 people who had never shown the slightest interest in HOA matters before. Karen cleared her throat dramatically before speaking. "Let's address the violation regarding your unauthorized exotic animal," she announced, enunciating each word like she was lecturing a child. "As documented here, your pet clearly violates Section 8 of our bylaws." I had to hold back a laugh. My cat, Whiskers, was a regular domestic shorthair. Nothing remotely exotic about him. I had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and he had been with me for 7 of them. I pulled out my veterinary records and set them on the table. I have all of his documentation right here. Karen, however, did not even glance at the papers. She was too busy admiring her freshly polished nails. "Rules are rules," she declared, while Susan and Linda nodded in perfect synchronization. "The fine stands, and if the animal is not removed within 30 days, additional penalties will apply." That was when I noticed something through the window. Karen's lawn, decorated with a cluster of bright pink flamingos, the same ones Susan and Linda also had in their yards. I remember drafting Section 7.3 of the bylaws, which specifically covered lawn ornaments, ensuring the rules were flexible enough to allow tasteful decorations while preventing excessive displays. "Speaking of rules," I said carefully, "I couldn't help but notice the matching lawn decorations at your properties. Perhaps we should take a moment to review the ornament guidelines as well." Karen's face turned bright red. "Those are limited edition collector's items, not common decorations. They're completely different." She shuffled through her papers, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Besides, we are here to discuss your pet violation, not my artistic choices." As I glanced around the room, I started to see other irregularities. The meeting minutes folder was unusually thin. The financial reports that were always present in the corner were nowhere in sight. And something else nagged at me. Wasn't there supposed to be a public notice period before board member changes? "I'd like to request copies of the last 6 months of meeting minutes," I said, keeping my voice even. "And while we are at it, I would love to see the documentation of the board member changes to ensure we are following all proper procedures." Karen's eye twitched slightly. "Those are being reorganized for efficiency purposes," she said, quickly steering the conversation back to her agenda. "Now, regarding your cat, we have received complaints about it disturbing the peace." "Really?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "Because I have an email here from our previous board president, specifically approving Whiskers' residency. Would you like to see it?" The room fell silent. Even Susan and Linda had stopped nodding in sync. "This meeting is adjourned," Karen announced abruptly, gathering her papers in a hurry. "You will receive further notice about your violations in writing." She practically sprinted out of the room, her heels clicking rapidly on the tile floor. As I walked home, pieces started falling into place in my mind. Mrs. Chin's fine over her bench, the missing board members, the sudden reorganization of official documents. Karen wasn't just being difficult about my cat. There was something much bigger going on. And as the person who wrote these bylaws, I was probably the only one who could figure out exactly what it was. Scrolling through my contacts, I found Bob's number. Maybe it was time for a friendly conversation about those missing financial reports. After all, if Karen wanted to enforce rules, then we needed to make sure we were looking at all of them. My hands were shaking as I spread out all the HOA violation notices across my dining room table. Something wasn't adding up, and I knew it. That morning, I had run into Mrs. Chan crying on her front porch, clutching a notice identical to mine. Her violation? The beautifully hand-carved memorial bench her grandchildren had given her to honor their grandfather. Karen had labeled it an unauthorized structure. I started making calls to other neighbors, and a clear pattern began to emerge. Every single homeowner who had received a violation in the past 3 months was either elderly or lived alone. Not a single one of Karen's friends had been fined, despite their obvious violations. The Andersons had painted their front door a glaring shade of purple, which Karen's friend Susan had described as charming at the last board meeting, even though the bylaws clearly stated that all external paint colors required approval. My legal instincts kicked in. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. I compiled photos of Karen's friends blatantly breaking the rules, the Williams' unauthorized above-ground pool, the Petersons' commercial vehicles parked in their driveway, and of course, those ridiculous flamingos multiplying on Karen's lawn. Then I created a map, marking every fine issued since Karen took over. The pattern was so obvious, it was almost laughable. Walking around the neighborhood with my camera, I noticed something even more suspicious. Karen's so-called landscaping improvement project had extended her backyard by nearly 3 feet into the community green space. I distinctly remembered handling the property surveys when I wrote the bylaws, and that was definitely not her land. That night, I dug through my old HOA files in the basement and found exactly what I needed, the original property maps. But just as I was piecing everything together, I heard a small rustling sound outside. I stepped onto my back porch and found little Tommy from next door, hiding behind my garage. His eyes were wide with fear. When I asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before whispering, "Karen said if I play basketball in my driveway again, my parents will get fined." My jaw clenched. Meanwhile, Karen's own grandchildren had a massive playground set up in their backyard, one that clearly exceeded height restrictions. The hypocrisy was staggering. I needed more information, and I knew exactly where to get it. The next morning, I made a trip to City Hall to check public records. What I found was shocking. Karen had never even filed the required paperwork for her home additions. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I dug deeper, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Karen's position as HOA president might not even be legitimate. According to state law, certain procedures had to be followed for board elections, and the records showed clear discrepancies in her appointment. That was when my doorbell rang. It was Robert, our retired former maintenance supervisor. "I've been waiting for someone to start asking questions," he said, holding a thick folder in his hands. I kept copies of everything. Inside were maintenance requests Karen had denied without board approval, emails showing her directing contracts to her brother's company, and photos of property damage she had blamed on innocent homeowners. Just as I was sorting through the evidence, my security camera alerted me to movement outside. I looked at the footage and saw Susan sneaking up to my porch, not to leave a violation notice, but to take pictures of my front door, the same door that had been approved by the previous board 5 years ago. I smirked. I just caught her in the act of harassment. Sitting down at my desk, I realized this wasn't just about my cat anymore. Karen wasn't just picking a fight with me. She was targeting every decent homeowner in this community. And she had no idea she was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the true purpose of the bylaws I had written. But first, I had one more call to make, to an old friend at the local newspaper. After all, nothing scares an HOA bully more than public exposure. And I had a feeling tomorrow's board meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. At first, I thought I was alone in this fight, but that changed when Mrs. Chin knocked on my door at 7 a.m., clutching a box of old HOA letters. Her hands trembled as she laid them out on my table. 5 years' worth of unfair fines, each one signed by Karen with that same arrogant signature. As we flipped through the papers, more neighbors started arriving. Within an hour, 3 more people had come forward with nearly identical stories. That was when I realized this was bigger than just my cat. I decided to take action. I began holding quiet meetings in my garage every Tuesday night. At first, it was just 5 of us sharing coffee and frustration. By the 3rd week, 15 residents packed into the space between my parked car and storage boxes. Each person brought new pieces to the puzzle. Photos of Karen's friends blatantly violating HOA rules without consequences, copies of sudden fee increases that had never gone through proper channels, and even video evidence of her yelling at kids for playing hopscotch in their own driveways. But the real breakthrough came when Bob, our normally quiet treasurer, surprised everyone by slipping me a USB drive after church. "I've been keeping track," he whispered. "The numbers don't add up." He was right. The spreadsheet showed thousands of dollars in so-called miscellaneous maintenance fees, fees that never resulted in actual repairs. Meanwhile, our community pool had been shut down for 3 months because we supposedly couldn't afford a new filter. That was the moment I knew Karen's corruption went beyond just power trips and fines. This was about money. Then came an unexpected ally, Jim, the former HOA president, who had moved to Florida after retiring. When I emailed him about the situation, he spent an entire weekend digging through his garage for old documents. What he found was a gold mine. He had the original meeting minutes from when I had written the bylaws, proving that Karen was making up rules that didn't exist. Even better, he had recordings of past board meetings where she had voted in favor of the very policies she was now fining people for breaking. With every new piece of evidence, my dining room transformed into something out of a detective show. I marked up a map of the neighborhood with red pins, each one representing a home that had received unfair fines. Green pins represented the houses of Karen's friends, who had somehow remained untouched despite obvious violations. The pattern was so blatant that it almost looked comical. But the real turning point came when Sarah, a journalist from the local newspaper, caught wind of what was happening. She had her own grudge against Karen, since her daughter had been fined for having a non-HOA-approved basketball hoop. She started asking questions about the HOA's financial records, and suddenly Karen had a lot of scheduling conflicts. Even funnier was the look on her face when she realized I was documenting every single rule she was breaking, including how her own yard didn't meet the standards she was enforcing on everyone else. Then Lisa, who worked at the county clerk's office, made a discovery that left me stunned. Karen had never properly filed key HOA paperwork, meaning she had been enforcing rules with no legal standing. She was so busy finding people and playing queen of the neighborhood that she had forgotten to keep the HOA itself in compliance. I couldn't help but smile. All those years I spent ensuring every bylaw was airtight were finally going to pay off. As our evidence pile grew, so did our confidence. People stopped paying Karen's ridiculous fines. Kids started playing outside again. Mrs. Chun put her wind chimes back up, and for the first time in months, their gentle tinkling wasn't immediately met with a violation notice. We were ready. The next board meeting was going to be the moment everything came crashing down for Karen. She wanted to play by the rules. It was time to show her that we had been playing the real game all along. The community center buzzed with tension as I walked in carrying my thick binder of evidence. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing her usual smug smile and an expensive blazer, completely unaware of what was coming. The room was packed. I had never seen so many neighbors at a board meeting before. Even Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't left his house since his hip surgery, had somehow made it. I noticed Karen's smile falter slightly when she saw my confident stride toward the podium. Susan leaned over and whispered something in her ear, but Karen just waved her off. Big mistake. Before we discussed the ridiculous fine about my cat, I began, keeping my voice steady and controlled. I'd like to address some concerning patterns I've discovered. I pulled out the first document from my binder, a detailed property map of our neighborhood. Funny how every single fine issued in the past 6 months has been given to homes marked in red on this map. Karen's expression twitched. Those are simply the violations we found. Interesting, I cut in because these red marks perfectly match the homes of people who voted against your election last year. The room erupted in whispers. But I wasn't done. And speaking of violations, let's talk about Article 2, Section 14 of our bylaws. Karen's face paled. She knew exactly what that section covered. I had written it specifically to prevent the abuse of power. The projection screen behind me lit up with archived photos of her house. Your unapproved pool installation last summer, the commercial vehicle parking violations, and of course, those lovely pink flamingos that somehow got a special exemption. Susan jumped up, her voice shrill. This is harassment. I calmly pulled out another document. Actually, Susan, according to the legal definition of harassment, which I've highlighted here from Section 8.2, a clause I also wrote, this is called documented evidence of bylaw violations. Would you like me to continue with the photos of your unauthorized fence extension? The room fell dead silent. Even Bob, our treasurer, struggled to hide his smirk. Karen's hands trembled as she shuffled through her papers, desperately searching for something to counter my claims. But the real issue isn't just selective enforcement, I continued, pulling out Mrs. Chen's violation notice. It's the blatant disregard for our community's values. This fine was issued to Mrs. Chun for a memorial bench, a bench that falls well within the acceptable guidelines I specifically included in Section 57 about memorial structures. Mrs. Chun, sitting in the front row, wiped away a tear as several neighbors patted her on the shoulder. Karen's face turned from pale to bright red. I saved the best for last. And now about my cat, Whiskers, the so-called exotic pet that triggered this entire investigation. I pulled out the original HOA pet clause, displaying it on the screen. I wrote this section myself 10 years ago, ensuring language that protects reasonable pet ownership. Would anyone like to guess who personally approved it? That's right. Our former board president, who sent me this notarized statement confirming it. The room erupted in a mix of laughter and outraged murmurs. Karen stood up abruptly, her voice trembling with anger. This is all circumstantial. You can't actually, Bob interrupted, standing up with his own folder. I have the financial records showing unauthorized administrative fees that weren't approved by the board. Should we discuss those too? Karen looked around the room, suddenly realizing she was cornered. Her face twisted into an ugly scowl as she grabbed her things. This isn't over. I'll sue every single one of you. I couldn't help but smile. Section 128, Karen. Frivolous legal threats against board members carry a $1,000 fine. Would you like me to add that to your tab? The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's smirk began to fade as I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector. The first slide appeared, a side-by-side comparison of her house's unapproved bright purple trim next to the exact bylaw she had used to fine 3 other homeowners for their non-standard paint colors. Let's start with something simple, I said, keeping my tone even. Section 4.2, which I wrote during the Great Paint Color debate of 2010. I clicked through photos showing Karen's friends' violations next to fines she had issued for the same infractions. Susan shifted uncomfortably when her 3-foot garden gnome collection popped up on the screen. Bob stepped forward next. I have something to add, he said, pulling out a stack of papers. These are bank statements showing unusual administrative fees being charged to specific homeowners, all of whom have filed complaints against board members in the past year. The room erupted again, this time with gasps of outrage. Karen shot to her feet, her face turning as purple as her house trim. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove anything. She grabbed her designer purse, nearly knocking over her water bottle. I'll sue every one of you. I held up my hand. Before you make threats, Karen, you might want to review Section 11.3. I pulled up the relevant page. I added this clause specifically to protect homeowners from retaliatory legal action. Any board member making unfounded legal threats faces immediate removal and a fine equal to the legal fees they are attempting to cause. The room was dead silent. Mrs. Chun, who had been quietly watching from her seat, slowly stood up. Her voice was shaky but firm. When my Henry died, I just wanted a small bench to remember him by. You told me it was against the rules and fined me $1,000. She pulled out a wrinkled letter. But I found this old newsletter from when you approved your friend's entire backyard memorial fountain. More neighbors started speaking up. The family fine for their basketball hoop showed pictures of Karen's own yard filled with unapproved playground equipment. The college student who was penalized for parking his work truck presented documentation proving Karen's son regularly parked his broken-down RV in the neighborhood. Karen's face went from purple to white as the evidence stacked against her. She tried to interrupt, but each time I calmly pulled up another bylaw. Each one I had personally written, proving exactly how she had broken them. When she realized half the room was recording everything on their phones, she made one last attempt. This is all hearsay. I demand to see the original bylaws. She thought she had me there. Most HOAs lose track of their original documents over time. Lucky for us, I had kept every single version with detailed notes. I projected my final slide, a scanned copy of the original bylaws with my signature and notary stamp. Article 7, Section 3. No board member shall selectively enforce these bylaws for personal gain or vendetta. I smiled. I added that after our last power-hungry president tried something similar. The vote was unanimous. Karen was removed from the board, along with Susan and 2 other members who had helped her scheme. The new board's first order of business? Approving Mrs. Chen's memorial bench, with a small garden around it, planted by the neighbors the following weekend. With Karen officially removed from power, the mood in the neighborhood shifted almost overnight. The tension that had settled over the community for months seemed to lift as people finally felt free to enjoy their homes without the constant threat of fines and harassment. The new HOA board wasted no time correcting Karen's mess, starting with a full audit of the HOA's finances. Bob, now promoted to HOA president, led the charge, and the results were worse than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars had been misallocated under vague maintenance expenses, but no one could find records of where the money had actually gone. More concerning, many of the fines Karen had issued were never deposited into the HOA's official accounts. The trail led straight to her personal bank records, revealing that she had funneled a significant portion of the money into a business owned by her brother. That was all the proof we needed to take legal action. Meanwhile, Karen's downfall had become the talk of the neighborhood. Her once loyal friends, Susan and Linda, were nowhere to be seen, likely distancing themselves from the inevitable consequences. Karen herself had retreated from public view, though her car was still in the driveway, meaning she hadn't skipped town just yet. I figured it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. Sure enough, a week later, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Karen was suing me for defamation. I couldn't help but laugh. If she thought she could intimidate me with legal threats, she had clearly forgotten who she was dealing with. I had spent years practicing law, and I knew exactly how flimsy her case was. Even better, her own signature was on most of the documents proving her misconduct. That same afternoon, Bob called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss our next steps. The community center was packed once again, but this time, the atmosphere was lighter, filled with an energy of determination rather than fear. Bob laid out the details of Karen's financial misconduct for everyone to see. There were gasps as he revealed that some of the missing funds had been used to renovate her backyard, on top of the illegal land expansion she had already attempted. I took the floor next, presenting the legal violations she had committed by bypassing election procedures and enforcing fabricated bylaws. As I spoke, I could see the anger growing among the residents. For months, they had suffered under Karen's rule, and now they saw just how deep her corruption ran. The vote was unanimous. The HOA would not only file a civil suit against Karen, but we would also push for a full criminal investigation into her misuse of funds. As soon as the meeting ended, Bob and I wasted no time drafting the necessary documents. With the overwhelming amount of evidence we had, the case against Karen was solid. But just as we finalized the paperwork, we received word from Lisa, the county clerk. Karen had just listed her house for sale. It was clear she was trying to leave before the consequences caught up with her. Unfortunately for her, she had overlooked one small detail. Her home was still in violation of multiple HOA bylaws. Before she could sell, she would have to repaint her garish purple trim and remove the illegal backyard additions. The irony was almost too perfect. After all the misery she had caused by enforcing rules selectively, she was now trapped by the very same regulations she had used to control others. But Karen wasn't done fighting just yet. Later that night, a car pulled up in front of my house, and I saw Karen storming toward my front door. My security camera caught everything as she pounded on the door, demanding that I drop the charges. I let her rant for a full 2 minutes before opening the door with my phone in hand, silently recording every word. Her threats, her accusations, her desperate attempts to spin the situation in her favor. It was all documented. When she finally realized what was happening, she turned pale and stumbled back. That's when I spoke. You just threatened legal action against a private resident while standing on their property. That's an additional violation of HOA policies, and I'll be sure to bring it up at the next meeting. Her face twisted in rage, but she knew she had lost. Without another word, she stormed back to her car and sped off. As I watched her leave, I knew this fight wasn't quite over yet. But I also knew one thing for sure. Karen was running out of moves, and soon, she would have no choice but to face the full weight of the consequences coming her way. Karen's desperation became more obvious as the days passed. She was running out of time, and with every move she made, she only buried herself deeper. The HOA's lawsuit had gained momentum, and the local news had picked up the story, exposing the extent of her corruption. Once the financial discrepancies were revealed, the authorities took notice, and an official investigation into HOA fund mismanagement was launched. Meanwhile, Karen still hadn't repainted her house, nor had she removed the illegal backyard additions, meaning she was stuck. She couldn't sell her home until the violations were resolved, and she couldn't afford the repairs with her assets frozen under legal scrutiny. She tried to push back, filing complaints against the HOA and even attempting to discredit me with false allegations. But none of it worked. The evidence was stacked against her. and every attempt she made to manipulate the situation only solidified the case against her. The neighborhood, once divided under her rule, had come together stronger than ever. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before now openly defied her, refusing to acknowledge the fines she had imposed and even restoring the very things she had banned. Mrs. Chen's memorial bench now sat proudly in the park, surrounded by fresh flowers planted by volunteers. Kids played basketball in their driveways without fear of being fined. Even the community pool had been reopened after emergency funds were allocated to fix the filter, a filter that had mysteriously remained unfixed under Karen's leadership. But Karen wasn't ready to back down completely. A week before her court date, she made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Late one evening, Bob called me with an urgent update. Karen had sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, claiming that the lawsuit against her was based on personal vendettas and that she would sue everyone involved for defamation. I couldn't help but laugh. The legal argument was laughably weak, and she clearly didn't realize that half the people she was threatening were already part of an active case against her. Still, I wasn't going to let my guard down. I spent the next few days making sure every single document, witness statement, and financial record was in order. When the court date finally arrived, Karen showed up looking visibly exhausted, her once perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her usual arrogance dulled by the reality of the situation. Her lawyer did his best to argue her case, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge didn't even need long to deliberate. The ruling was clear. Karen was found guilty of financial misconduct, and she was ordered to repay every cent she had stolen. On top of that, she was permanently banned from holding any position within an HOA, meaning she could never abuse power in a community like this again. But the real victory came when the court addressed her attempts to sue me and the other homeowners. The judge dismissed her claims entirely, even warning her that further frivolous lawsuits could result in additional fines. As I left the courtroom, I saw Karen sitting alone, staring blankly at the paperwork in her hands. It was over. She had spent months terrorizing the neighborhood, believing she was untouchable. But in the end, she had fallen victim to the very rules she had tried to manipulate. When I returned home that evening, the entire neighborhood was gathered at the community center, celebrating the victory. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, relief, and a sense of unity that had been missing for far too long. Bob raised a toast to new beginnings, and Mrs. Chun, for the first time in months, smiled without worry. Looking around at my neighbors, I realized something. Karen may have ruled with fear, but in the end, she had only made the community stronger. And as for me, well, I had one last thing to do. I went home, framed Whisker's honorary HOA inspector certificate, and placed it right next to my law degree. Karen's house sat untouched for weeks, a silent reminder of her downfall. With no way to sell it until the HOA violations were resolved and her financial troubles mounting, she had no choice but to comply with the very rules she had once weaponized. The bright purple trim was finally repainted to an HOA-approved shade of gray, a fitting color considering her situation. The illegal backyard expansion was removed, restoring the community green space she had tried to claim as her own. But by the time the house was back in compliance, Karen was gone. She had packed up and left town, vanishing without so much as a goodbye. No one was surprised. The neighborhood had already moved on, stronger than ever. The new HOA board, now filled with people who actually cared about the community, worked to undo the damage she had caused. The absurd fines were rescinded, and the bylaws were reinforced to prevent anyone from abusing power the way Karen had. The financial investigation revealed even more hidden misconduct, leading to additional legal action against Karen and her associates. But for the rest of us, it was over. The community had reclaimed what was rightfully ours. As for me, I finally had peace. No more violation notices taped to my door, no more secret HOA meetings, no more legal battles against a power-hungry tyrant. I could finally sit on my porch, sip my coffee, and enjoy my home without interference. And so, could everyone else? Mrs. Chen's bench remained in place, now surrounded by a small memorial garden tended by the neighbors. Bob continued his role as HOA president, ensuring fairness and transparency in every decision. The community pool, once closed due to Karen's mismanagement, was now thriving, filled with laughter and life again. Even the children, once afraid of being fined for playing outside, roamed freely, their basketball hoops standing tall in driveways where they belonged. One evening, as I relaxed with a book, Whiskers curled up beside me, content as ever. I glanced at his framed honorary HOA inspector certificate on the wall and smirked. Of all the things Karen had tried to control, it had been my cat that ultimately unraveled everything. If only she had known that a $500 fine over an exotic pet would be the beginning of her downfall. In the end, karma had done what it always does. It came back around with claws sharper than ever.